The night my barn went up in flames, I stood barefoot in the dirt, watching years of work and family history burn to the ground. Neighbors huddled together in the glow of the fire trucks, whispering, pointing their faces painted orange by the blaze. And there she was, Lena Hartman, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, smirking like she had just won a trophy. "Maybe now you'll finally see reason, Dante," she sneered, her voice sharp enough to cut through the crackle of the fire. But what Lena didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong man. I wasn't just Dante Carver, the stubborn landowner who refused to join her HOA empire. I was something far more dangerous. And this fire, it wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I thought I was buying peace and quiet. My land sat right on the edge of suburbia, just far enough from the manicured lawns to hear crickets at night, but close enough that the HOA thought my existence was their business. I had a barn, some acreage, and the kind of freedom that comes with not answering to anyone but the county and the fire codes. It was simple. It was mine. And apparently that made me public enemy number one in the eyes of Lena Hartman. Now, Lena wasn't your typical neighbor. She wasn't the type to wave hello from the mailbox or bring over a casserole when you moved in. No, Lena saw herself as a general commanding an army of terrified homeowners. If the lawns were an inch too tall, she barked. If Christmas lights stayed up past January 2nd, she fined. If a kid parked his car on the street overnight, she called towing before sunrise. She thrived on control, and anyone who lived outside her reach was a threat. That's where I came in. I didn't live under HOA jurisdiction. My property line was the border, a stubborn patch of land she couldn't regulate. To her, it was like having a free country smack in the middle of her dictatorship. And the idea that one man could resist her rules, it ate her alive. At first, she tried charm. I remember her knocking on my door in her tailored blazer clipboard in hand, smile stretched so wide I could practically hear it crack. "Dante, darling," she cooed, "you'd be such a wonderful addition to our community. Think of the benefits: access to the clubhouse neighborhood, events, voting rights." She made it sound like I'd been waiting all my life to pay her fees and bow to her bylaws. I told her politely that I was fine where I was. I liked my independence. The smile dropped. From then on, it was war. First came the letters. Harmless at first, reminders about voluntary membership, then stronger: "You are out of compliance with neighborhood standards," which was rich considering I wasn't part of her HOA at all. Then came the threats bolded in red ink: "Failure to cooperate will result in legal action." I laughed. Legal action? Against a man who spent 20 years reading fire codes and investigating arson? She had no idea who she was messing with. Then came the visits. Lena would show up unannounced, stomping across my gravel driveway in her high heels, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. She'd poke around the barn, squint at my tools, complain that my rustic aesthetic was bringing down property values. I'd remind her she was trespassing. She'd remind me that the community had standards. I reminded her again that I wasn't in her community. But you can't reason with someone drunk on power. Soon she escalated. I'd come home to find flyers plastered on my gate warning neighbors that I was non-compliant and hostile. I'd overhear whispers at the grocery store, people saying Dante Carver thought he was above the rules. Lena was spinning her web of gossip, weaving me into her villain story. I'll admit, it started to get under my skin. Not because I cared what she thought of me, but because I saw how easily people bought into her drama. Folks I'd barely spoken to now looked at me like I was the problem, like I was some outlaw hiding from justice. And that's when I realized something important. Lena didn't just want me in her HOA. She needed me in it. See, to her, power wasn't complete unless it was absolute. Every property, every family, every inch of land had to bend to her will. And my barn, my acreage, they were reminders that her little kingdom had limits. I was the crack in her glass castle, and cracks in her mind had to be sealed or shattered. I still remember one particular afternoon a week before the fire. I was repairing the barn doors, sweat dripping down my back, when Lena strutted up in her sun hat and designer sunglasses. She didn't even bother with small talk this time. "You can't keep this up forever, Dante," she snapped. "You're undermining the unity of this neighborhood." I leaned on my hammer, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Lena, the day I take orders from you is the day hell freezes over. Or, knowing your style, the day you set it on fire." Her lips tightened. For a moment, I swear I saw a spark of something dangerous in her eyes. Not the usual annoyance, not just control, but something darker. And that's when I should have known. That barn wasn't just in her way. To her, it was a symbol of resistance, of defiance. Burning it wasn't just about hurting me. It was about proving a point to everyone else, that if you crossed Lena Hartman, you'd be reduced to ashes. Of course, what she didn't know, what made the whole thing so deliciously ironic, was that she picked the one enemy she couldn't possibly defeat with fire, because I wasn't just Dante Carver's stubborn landowner. I was Fire Marshal Dante Carver. And if she thought she could outburn me, she was about to learn the hard way. If Lena Hartman had been satisfied with letters gossip and the occasional trespass into my driveway, maybe things would have fizzled out. Maybe the neighborhood would have laughed off her obsession, chalking it up to boredom or too much Chardonnay at HOA meetings. But no, Lena wasn't built for enough. She was built for more. And more meant escalation. The first sign was the so-called HOA security patrol. Now mind you, our neighborhood doesn't need security. The biggest crime we'd ever had was a teenager ding-dong ditching at Christmas. Yet one morning I spotted a pair of men in ill-fitting polo shirts cruising slowly past my fence line in a golf cart with a magnetic sign that read HOA Neighborhood Enforcement. Clipboards in their laps, sunglasses on like they were auditioning for budget CSI Suburbia. I walked out coffee in hand, leaned on my mailbox, and watched them write furiously while staring at my property. Finally, one looked up and said, "Sir, we're documenting potential violations for review." I smirked. Violations of what? My right to have a barn, my freedom to breathe air, not approved by Lena Hartman. They didn't answer. Just scribbled something and drove off, tires squeaking like the whole world depended on their notes. That was Lena's style: intimidation by paperwork. She didn't need actual power if she could bury you under enough fake authority. Next came the driveway debacle. It started with a letter, of course. A bright yellow envelope with the words Urgent Community Access, SSU stamped across the front. Inside, Lena declared that my driveway was technically an easement and that the HOA had rights to use it for overflow parking during events. I nearly choked on my sandwich reading that one. My driveway, the one I paved myself on land I paid taxes for, suddenly belonged to her party guests. Naturally, I refused. I sent her a reply that said in no uncertain terms, if anyone parks in my driveway, they'd better be ready to pay rent or move fast when my tow truck friend shows up. That didn't go over well. The next weekend, during one of Lena's infamous community socials, I found 6 SUVs crammed against my fence line, practically blocking my entrance. She was testing me, so I tested her back. I made one phone call, and 15 minutes later, those SUVs were hooked up and rolling down the road behind a tow truck convoy. I swear the screech of Lena's voice carried for blocks. "Dante Carver, you are ruining this community," she shrieked, standing in her heels on my gravel. "You think you're untouchable, you think you're above us." I leaned against the barn door, the same one that would later burn, and said calm as ever, "No, Lena, I just think I'm not one of you. Big difference." Her face went red like a match about to spark. But here's the thing about bullies. When you stand your ground, they don't back off. They double down. So Lena doubled down. The gossip turned nastier. Suddenly, I was a danger to children. Someone circulated a rumor that I stored explosives in my barn. One neighbor even whispered that I was building a meth lab out back, which was hilarious considering my barn was full of fire, safety manuals, ladders, and a tractor that hadn't started since Clinton was president. Then came the pettier stuff. Mysterious complaints filed with the county about unauthorized animals. I had chickens, legal ones. Noise complaints when I ran my lawnmower at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. Even a notice that my barn's paint color was non-compliant with community standards. Again, I wasn't in the community. But details never stopped Lena. Through it all, I stayed calm. Outwardly, inwardly, I was cataloging every move she made, every threat she whispered, every neighbor she tried to turn against me. And maybe that calmness, that refusal to give her the big reaction she craved, drove her crazier than anything else. One night, about a week before the fire, I caught her standing at the edge of my property. Midnight. No clipboard this time. Just standing there in the moonlight, arms crossed, staring at my barn like it had personally insulted her. I stepped onto the porch and called out, "Lose something, Lena, or just practicing your villain pose." She didn't answer. Just stared for another moment before stomping off into the shadows. That's when I knew something bad was coming. But I'll tell you the moment I truly felt the shift. It was during the HOA's monthly meeting, the one she insisted I attend, even though I wasn't a member. To discuss integration, she said. I showed up mostly for the popcorn factor. Halfway through, Lena stood up, gestured dramatically toward me, and said, "Neighbors, look at what happens when we allow outsiders to disrespect our rules. Look at that eyesore of a barn. He refuses unity. He rejects progress. He endangers us all." Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned. I swear half those people didn't even know where my property line ended. But Lena's words had weight. Fear does that. I stood stretched slowly and smiled. Lena, with all due respect, if my barn is the biggest danger this neighborhood has, you all should sleep like babies. Unless, of course, someone decides to light a match. Her eyes narrowed into slits. There it was, the unspoken threat, hanging heavy in the air. My barn wasn't just property to her anymore. It was a symbol of defiance. And symbols to tyrants like Lena Hartman must be destroyed. That night, as I walked back home under the streetlights, I couldn't shake the image of her standing in the shadows staring at my barn like she was already watching it burn. And the part that chilled me, I realized she might actually do it. I've seen a lot of fires in my career. House fires, car fires, even a church steeple that lit up one July 4th when a firework went rogue. But nothing prepared me for the night I watched my own barn burn. It started quiet, the way trouble always does. One moment I was half asleep in my recliner, a book sliding out of my hand, the crickets humming outside. The next I caught a strange orange flicker through the window. At first I thought it was lightning, a summer storm rolling in. But then I smelled it, that acrid choking scent of burning wood. I bolted upright, heart pounding. My boots were on before my brain even caught up. I flung open the front door, and there it was, my barn, my grandfather's barn, the one I'd patched, painted, and poured sweat into, was a roaring inferno. Flames licked the night sky, twisting into a column of smoke so thick it blotted out the stars. Neighbors poured into the street, their faces bathed in orange. Some gasped. Some grabbed their phones. And some whispered. Because even in the glow of tragedy, gossip doesn't take a night off. And then I saw her, Lena Hartman. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed, lips curled into a smirk so faint it might have been missed by anyone else. But I'd spent too long reading people's faces, too long analyzing suspects in arson cases. I knew that look. It wasn't shock. It wasn't horror. It was satisfaction. She leaned toward one of her lackeys and muttered something loud enough that I caught a fragment. Maybe now he'll learn. Maybe now I'll learn. My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms. I wanted to march across that lawn, grab her by the collar of her overpriced cardigan, and demand she admit it right there in front of everyone. But I didn't. Because if there's one thing I've learned as a fire marshal, it's that rage doesn't rebuild and anger doesn't convict. Evidence does. Still standing there, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything I'd lost. The barn wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was history. My grandfather had built it with his bare hands in the 1,940 seconds. My father taught me how to swing a hammer under that roof. I'd stored my tools there, my tractor, the heirlooms that didn't fit in the house. And now it was collapsing in on itself. The beams snapping like bones, sparks flying into the night like fireflies from hell. The fire trucks screamed down the street, minutes later, red and blue lights flashing against the dark. I heard the hiss of water as hoses opened up, the shouted orders of firefighters racing to contain the blaze before it spread to the tree line. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was hollow rage. Because I wasn't watching just another fire scene. I was watching my life's work reduced to ash, and I knew exactly who struck the match. Of course, Lena played her part well. When one firefighter asked the crowd if anyone had seen suspicious activity, Lena clutched her chest dramatically. Oh, it must have been an accident. That barn was such a hazard after all. Old wood so close to the road. She let the words dangle like bait. I caught her eyes. And for the briefest second, the smirk returned. That was when I made my decision. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. This wasn't going to be another one of Lena Hartman's little HOA power plays. She hadn't just vandalized a fence or filed a bogus complaint. She'd committed arson. And she'd done it thinking I was just Dante Carver, the stubborn landowner she could bully into submission. But she was wrong. I was Fire Marshal Dante Carver. And while she thought she'd burned me down, all she'd done was light a fuse I'd been holding back for far too long. I stayed outwardly calm that night, took the firefighters' statements, thanked them for their work, even let Lena wander around pretending to be a concerned citizen, but inside my mind was already racing. I replayed the smell, the flicker, the timing. I cataloged the suspicious smirk, the overheard comment, the way she slipped into the shadows when the police cruiser rolled up. I knew the signs. Accelerant most likely. Gasoline, maybe kerosene. I'd find the traces in the soil on the debris. She thought she could outsmart the fire marshal. She might as well have signed her name in soot across the barn wall. When the crowd dispersed and the fire trucks pulled away, leaving only steam and glowing embers, I stood alone in the dirt. Smoke stung my eyes. Ash clung to my shirt. And yet, beneath the grief, beneath the loss, something else burned hotter than the flames ever could. Resolve. Lena wanted me broken. She wanted me crawling to her, begging for HOA forgiveness. Instead, she just handed me the greatest weapon I could have asked for, undeniable proof of who she really was. I turned back to the husk of the barn one last time that night. The roof had caved in completely, the skeletal beams jutting up like blackened ribs against the sky. For a second, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, steady and strong, telling me not to bow to bullies. And I whispered back, "Don't worry, she'll pay." Because in that moment, I wasn't just a victim. I wasn't just a homeowner who'd lost his barn. I was a fire marshal. And Lena Hartman had just set herself on a collision course with justice. I didn't sleep that night. The fire was out, the barn was gone, and the crowd of neighbors had scattered back to their cozy beds. But me, I sat on my porch with a flashlight and a notebook, staring at the smoking crater where my barn had once stood. The fire was over, but the real work was just beginning. Most people would have called it quits, called their insurance company, filed a police report, cried a little, maybe poured a stiff drink and moved on. But I'm not most people. I'm Dante Carver, fire marshal, which meant the minute that barn went up, my brain switched into investigation mode. I started where I always do, the ground. Fires tell stories if you know how to listen. The burn patterns were obvious. The flames hadn't started randomly or from an electrical fault. No, this fire had raced hot and fast like a predator set loose. The char lines pointed outward, spreading from a single ignition point near the side door. And the kicker, the smell still lingered, faint but unmistakable. Accelerant, gasoline. I crouched down, running my fingers over the soil, feeling the slick residue that clung to the dirt. In my career, I'd testified in over 40 arson cases. I knew what I was looking at, and now it was personal. Of course, the local police would write it off as undetermined origin. They didn't have the training to catch subtleties, but I did. And Lena Hartman had no idea she'd just set fire to the one man who could prove it. The next morning I took photos, every angle, every scorch mark. I collected soil samples, sealed them in jars, labeled them carefully. Evidence chain of custody, the same way I do at work. Because this wasn't just about insurance. This was about building an airtight case. And Lena, she kept playing her part. By noon, she was out strolling the block, coffee mug in hand, playing concerned neighbor. I overheard her telling Mrs. Adler, "Such a tragedy, isn't it? But honestly, that old barn was falling apart. A hazard waiting to happen. Maybe this is for the best. For the best." Those 3 words sat in my gut like lead. That evening, I paid a visit to the fire station. My old crew knew me well, respected me. They'd seen me crawl through smoke and drag kids out of burning houses. When I asked for a look at their incident report, they didn't question it. And sure enough, the official notes said it plain, 'cause undetermined possible accidental ignition. Accidental, my ass. I kept my cards close, though. I didn't want to tip my hand too soon. The beauty of an investigation like this is patience. Let the suspect think they've gotten away with it. Let them relax, slip up, grow cocky. That's when you catch them. So, I acted defeated. When Lena cornered me at the mailbox the next day, crocodile tears painted across her face, I played along. "Oh, Dante," she said, clutching her pearls like she was auditioning for a soap opera. "I just can't imagine what you're going through. If you'd been part of the HOA, maybe we could have helped you prevent this tragedy." I forced a weak smile. "Maybe you're right, Lena. Maybe I've been too stubborn." Her eyes glittered. Hook, line, sinker. From that point, I noticed her shoulders loosen when she saw me. She even started waving again like nothing had happened. But behind her little act, she had no clue that I was shadowing her moves, collecting witnesses, and laying the trap. One of the first cracks came from her own allies. Old man Jenkins, been in the neighborhood since Nixon was in office, mentioned offhand that he'd seen Lena's SUV near my property around midnight, the night of the fire. "Strange," he muttered, considering she said she was asleep by 10. Bingo. I wrote it down. Then there was the gas can. I found it tucked in the ditch just 50 yards from my fence line. Red plastic reeking of fuel with greasy fingerprints smeared across the handle. I carefully bagged it, knowing it was the smoking gun, or in this case the smoking can. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit together. But here's the thing about gathering evidence against someone like Lena: you can't just be right. You have to be undeniably right. Because HOA presidents, they're slippery. They spin narratives faster than a washing machine. I knew she'd twist anything less than rock-solid proof into another conspiracy against her, so I bided my time. Attended her HOA meetings, sat quietly in the back while she railed about outsiders endangering our unity. Listened as she doubled down, painting herself as the victim of my supposed hostility. The irony almost made me laugh. Meanwhile, my file grew thicker: photographs, soil tests, eyewitness statements, even a discreet request to the county for nearby traffic cam footage. Turns out those cameras caught her SUV creeping down my road the night of the blaze. And every night after the house was quiet, I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the evidence, a slow smile spreading across my face. Because Lena thought she'd silenced me with fire. She thought she'd destroyed my will. But all she'd done was hand me a case, so perfect, so bulletproof, that even her smooth HOA speeches couldn't save her. One night, as I packed the file neatly into a folder, I whispered to myself, "Patience, Dante. She's already burned herself. You just need to show everyone the ashes. And when the time came, when the spotlight turned on her in front of the entire neighborhood, I'd be ready. Because justice isn't loud. It's methodical." And I was about to deliver it with the precision of a man who'd spent his life reading the language of fire. Most people who lose a barn might retreat, lick their wounds, and pray their insurance covers it. But me, I wasn't built to roll over. Lena Hartman thought she'd burned me down into silence, but what she actually did was light the fire of my revenge. And trust me, I don't burn quietly. The beauty of being underestimated is that people stop watching their backs. Lena strutted around like she'd won, parading her smug little grin at HOA meetings, whispering to neighbors about how tragic my loss was, all while implying it was somehow my fault. She thought I was broken. She thought the fire had ended the story. But for me, the fire was just the prologue. I started small, subtle, not enough to tip her off, but just enough to shake her throne. First came the inspectors. Funny thing about a neighborhood as shiny as ours, the shinier the surface, the easier it is to find cracks when you actually look, and I knew exactly where to look. Lena had built her reputation on being above reproach, but her house, oh, it was a goldmine of violations. Improper wiring in her deck, lights a fence an inch too tall, and let's not even talk about the garage conversion she'd done without permits. So I made a few anonymous calls. Building inspection, code enforcement, even pest control, because it doesn't hurt to have a truck with giant cartoon roaches parked in front of the HOA president's house. The results were glorious. One morning I sipped my coffee from the porch and watched as 2 city inspectors marched up Lena's driveway, clipboards in hand. From across the street I could see her frozen smile, that this must be a mistake look plastered across her face. She waved her manicured hands, tried to sweet-talk them, but inspectors don't bend to charm, especially when tipped off by a fire marshal who knows the book better than they do. By lunchtime, there were red violation stickers slapped on her front window. The Queen's castle was crumbling. Next, I turned up the social heat. CHOAs thrive on fear and gossip. Lena's weapon of choice had always been rumor, painting me as the villain, the outsider, refusing unity. So, I flipped the narrative. A few conversations at the hardware store, a quiet word to Mr. Jenkins about how odd it was Lena had been out at midnight, the night of the fire, a mention to Mrs. Adler that accelerant had been found on my property. I didn't need to say much, just enough, because gossip is like dry grass, all it takes is a spark. And suddenly the same neighbors who used to glare at me were whispering behind Lena's back instead. She always did seem intense. Midnight, really. That's suspicious. Do you think she had something to do with it? Oh, it was delicious. The real kicker came at the next HOA meeting. I showed up as always and sat quietly in the back. Lena stood at the podium trying to rally the crowd with her usual theatrics. We must remain strong against divisive forces. We cannot let outsiders destroy our unity. But this time, instead of nods, I saw eye rolls, whispers, doubt creeping into her little empire. Then Jenkins raised his hand. "Lena, where were you the night of the fire?" Her face twitched. Just for a second. But in a room full of people who had lived under her rule for years, that twitch was louder than a scream. She stammered, tried to cover it, but the damage was done. Her credibility, once bulletproof, was cracking like glass under pressure. Meanwhile, I kept the pressure coming. Noise complaints filed against her for late-night HOA strategy meetings. Parking enforcement ticketing her precious SUV when it sat too long on the curb. Heck, I even called the county forestry department to investigate her landscaping practices. Turns out those imported hedges, she bragged about technically invasive species. One by one, her perfect facade was collapsing, and the best part, she didn't know it was me pulling the strings. From her perspective, the universe had simply turned against her. The once feared HOA president was now the subject of snickers at barbecues the woman neighbors avoided instead of obeyed. Every time I passed her on the sidewalk, she glared at me with bloodshot eyes, muttering about sabotage. And I'd smile. Sabotage, Lena. Sounds like projection. The paranoia ate at her. I could see it. She started ranting during meetings, lashing out at her own board members, accusing them of disloyalty. The same people who once hung on her every word now shifted uncomfortably, whispering afterward about her mental state. She was unraveling. And I hadn't even revealed the ace up my sleeve yet. Because while Lena scrambled to keep her grip on power, I was still building my case. Every rumor, every witness, every scrap of evidence tied her tighter to the fire. She thought she was fighting me in the shadows, but in reality she was already trapped in the spotlight. She just didn't know it yet. I remember walking past the ruins of my barn one evening, the air still carrying a faint whiff of charred wood. I looked at those blackened beams and smiled. Because they weren't ruins anymore. They were a weapon. Proof. A reminder that Lena had already lost, she just hadn't realized it. And soon I'd show her. Because she thought she was the flame. But me, I was the extinguisher. The night of the HOA meeting that changed everything, I arrived early. Not because I wanted a good seat, I always sat in the back half hidden like a man just passing through, but because I wanted to see the looks on their faces when the truth hit. The clubhouse was buzzing. Plastic chairs scraped across the tile floor, neighbors shuffled papers and whispered, and Lena Hartman, dressed in her signature blazer and pearls, stood at the front like a queen, about to deliver her royal decree. Except this queen looked rattled. Her once flawless smile was tight around the edges, her hands twitching against her clipboard. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Tonight was the night. Ladies and gentlemen, Lena began, her voice sharp, commanding, rehearsed. We are at a crossroads. Our community has been under siege, not from outsiders, not from developers, but from one of our very own. A man who refuses to respect our unity. A man whose reckless behavior has endangered us all. Her eyes locked on me. Dante Carver, she said, spitting my name like poison. You have been nothing but trouble since you moved here. You think you're above the rules. And now your negligence has resulted in a fire that could have destroyed more than just your barn. It could have spread to the neighborhood, to our homes, to our families. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors turned toward me, their faces caught between suspicion and uncertainty. I stayed perfectly still. Lena's voice rose, trembling with faux righteousness. I call for this community to take legal action, to demand accountability, to finally put an end to this menace in our midst. Applause broke out, but it was weak, scattered. Some clapped half-heartedly, others just looked down at their shoes. And that was my cue. I stood slowly, letting the chair legs scrape deliberately across the floor. The room fell quiet, the sound of my boots echoing as I stepped forward. Lena's eyes widened just slightly, but enough for me to savor. Funny thing, Lena, I said, my voice steady, carrying across the room. You've spent months painting me as the villain, and you almost pulled it off. Almost. A murmur swept through the room. But here's the problem with lies, I continued. They don't hold up against facts. And I have facts. Hard ones. Lena snorted, trying to recover. Oh, please. More of your paranoia, your baseless accusations. You're nothing but a bitter. That's when I pulled it out. From inside my jacket, I flipped open the leather case, and the gold shield glinted under the fluorescent lights. Gasps echoed around the room. My name is Dante Carver, I said, my voice rising. I am a certified fire marshal, sworn to investigate and prosecute cases of arson. And make no mistake, that's exactly what happened to my barn. The silence was electric. Lena's jaw dropped, her practiced confidence faltering. You're lying, she hissed. You're making this up. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Am I? Let's see what the evidence says. I opened the folder I'd been carrying, laying photos across the table at the front. Char patterns, soil test results, chemical analysis reports. Each page slammed down like a hammer. Accelerant residue at the ignition point. Slam. Eyewitness testimony placing your vehicle near my property at midnight. Slam. Traffic camera footage showing your SUV creeping down my road the night of the fire. Slam. And the pièce de résistance? I held up a clear evidence bag. Inside sat the red gas can, its fingerprints preserved in powder. Your fingerprints on the container used to start the blaze. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, neighbors, craning their necks to see. Lena went pale. That's not, you can't, this is a setup, she sputtered, clutching the podium like it might keep her from sinking. He's lying, he's framing me, I'm the president of this HOA, for heaven's sake. But the tide had already turned. Her board members, once loyal soldiers, were now inching away from her, whispering wide-eyed. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. You wanted to paint me as reckless, Lena, as negligent. But the truth is, you committed arson. You risked lives, you endangered families, and you thought you'd get away with it. You thought I was just some stubborn homeowner. I leaned in, my voice dropping, so only she and the hushed crowd could hear. But you lit a fire in the wrong man's yard. Right on cue, the doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. 2 uniformed officers strode in, their badges flashing. Lena Hartman, one called, voice firm. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The room exploded. Neighbors gasped, some shouted, others clutched their phones to record the spectacle. Lena staggered back, shaking her head violently. "No, you can't do this. I built this community. I am this community." The officers took her by the arms, reading her rights as she wailed, her voice rising to a shriek. The once feared queen of the HOA was dragged through the same doors she used to enter like royalty, and the neighborhood watched not with pity, not with loyalty, but with something else. Relief. For the first time in years, they were free of her grip. I turned back to the crowd, my badge still in hand, my evidence spread across the table. "The fire didn't destroy me," I said quietly. "It revealed her. And now, justice is being served." The applause this time wasn't weak. It thundered through the clubhouse, drowning out Lena's fading shrieks as she was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. And I stood there, the smoke of my old barn still lingering in my clothes, knowing the fight was far from over, but the balance had shifted. Because the truth was out. And there's nothing more dangerous to a tyrant than the truth. The night Lena Hartman was arrested, the neighborhood didn't just breathe, it exhaled like a pressure valve, finally being released. Years of intimidation, threats, and fines had built up inside those people, and watching her being hauled out in handcuffs was the moment the dam broke. I stood outside the clubhouse, the evening air still warm against my face, as neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, gossiping, some even laughing nervously. Phones buzzed with messages flying faster than wildfire. By morning I knew the entire block would know the once feared queen of the HOA had been dethroned, and sure enough, by dawn the next day the story was everywhere. Local news vans parked at the subdivision entrance, their cameras pointed at the shiny "Welcome to Maplewood Estates" sign. Headlines screamed HOA president arrested for arson and suburban scandal leader accused of burning barn. Reporters knocked on doors asking for comments. Some neighbors gave polite denials, others spilled every juicy detail they had. It was chaos. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy every second of it. The HOA board scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. They called an emergency meeting, without Lena, of course, to figure out who would take over. Watching them squirm was almost comical. These were the same people who once barked at homeowners about mailbox paint shades, now wringing their hands because their fearless leader had turned out to be a criminal. "Do we suspend her indefinitely?" one board member whispered. "Indefinitely," another shot back. "She set fire to a man's barn. She's gone for good, gone for good." I savored those words. But the fallout wasn't just political, it was personal. Take Mrs. Adler, for example. For years, she'd been Lena's most loyal lieutenant, marching door to door with violation slips and handing out gossip like candy. After the arrest, she showed up on my porch with a pie in her hands and shame in her eyes. "Mr. Carver," she said softly, I should have seen it. I should have known. I let her turn me against you. I stared at the pie cherry by the smell of it, and then at her. "Mrs. Adler," I said, my voice, "even you don't owe me pie. You owe me honesty. Next time a bully comes knocking, don't open the door." She nodded, tears brimming, and shuffled away. Then there was Jenkins. The old man cornered me by the mailbox one morning, puffing on his ever-present cigar. "Knew she was bad news," he muttered, smoke curling into the air. "But arson hell, son, you handled it better than most." My respect. Coming from Jenkins, that was basically a standing ovation. The irony of it all hit me hardest when I saw the HOA newsletters the following week. For years, Lena's picture had been plastered across the front page, stern smile, pearls, promises of community unity. Now a blank space where her face should have been replaced by a bland statement. "The board is working to restore stability and trust." Stability and trust, two things Lena never understood. As for Lena herself, well, her world collapsed overnight. The police reports went public. The county prosecutor announced charges: arson, reckless endangerment, and property damage. Bail was set high, and even her once loyal followers didn't rush to post it. The woman who once strutted around like a monarch now sat in a cell stripped of pearls and power alike. I heard she tried to spin it at first, claiming she'd been framed, that I had manufactured evidence, that this was all some vendetta. But the facts were too strong. Accelerant residue, fingerprints, camera footage, her midnight SUV drive. The narrative she'd spun so easily against others unraveled when turned against her. And the neighborhood, it didn't mourn her. In fact, it blossomed. For the first time in years, kids played in the cul-de-sacs without fear of violation notices. Neighbors chatted freely, no longer whispering in corners like conspirators. Lawns grew a little wilder, Christmas lights lingered past New Year's. And you know what? No one cared. Life returned to normal. For me, though, the victory was bittersweet. I'd won, yes. Justice was on my side. But every time I passed the charred skeleton of my barn, my chest tightened. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was legacy. It was memory. My father teaching me how to swing a hammer. My grandfather's laughter echoing as we stacked hay. Gone all of it in one night of Lena's rage. Still, there was something poetic about it. Lena thought fire would destroy me. Instead, it destroyed her. One evening, I stood by the ruins, the last of the embers, long gone, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. Because in those ashes lay proof that tyrants always fall sometimes by their own hands. I looked out at the neighborhood, quieter, now freer, and I couldn't help but laugh softly to myself. The woman who thought she ruled with fire, I said aloud, was undone by the man who mastered it. And I knew deep down that while the barn was gone, something bigger had been rebuilt. Trust, respect, freedom, things no HOA president could ever burn down. They say revenge is best served cold. Personally, I've always thought it's best served hot, straight off a smoker with a rack of ribs and a side of cornbread. And after everything Lena Hartman put me through, I decided my revenge would come in the form of hickory smoke and laughter echoing through the neighborhood she once ruled with fear. But before the barbecue, there had to be a rebuild. Insurance paid out quickly once my evidence hit the prosecutor's desk. Arson cases tend to move the wheels faster, and when the adjuster saw the file, I handed him soil tests, chemical analysis, fingerprints. He didn't argue a cent. Within weeks, the check arrived, enough to not only replace the barn, but to upgrade it. And upgrade it I did. The old barn had been my grandfather's pride, sturdy but simple. The new one, steel beams fireproof, siding a ventilation system that would make any inspector drool. I poured concrete floors, installed state-of-the-art equipment, and even added a loft for storage. If the old barn had been a symbol of resistance, the new barn was a monument to victory. Neighbors stopped by during construction, curious, supportive, even a little embarrassed by how they'd treated me before. Some offered tools, others lent a hand carrying lumber. Jenkins showed up with a cooler full of beer and barked orders like a foreman's cigar clamped between his teeth. "Make that beam tighter, Carver. You don't want the damn thing falling on your head." I couldn't help but grin. After months of whispers and side eyes, here they were helping me rebuild brick by brick, nail by nail. Lena had tried to isolate me, but in the end she'd only isolated herself. By the time the barn stood complete, towering over the lot with gleaming red walls and crisp white trim, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a rallying point, a place that said, loud and clear, we're free. So I planned the barbecue. Invitations weren't formal, just word of mouth, a few flyers pinned to mailboxes. Barn-raising BBQ, Saturday at 5. Bring your appetite. Everyone was welcome, except of course Lena Hartman and her tiny circle of diehards, who now skulked around like ghosts in a town that no longer feared them. Saturday rolled in hot and bright, the smell of summer heavy in the air. I fired up the smoker at dawn, slow-cooking ribs until the meat nearly fell off the bone. By mid-afternoon, the yard filled with the sound of laughter, kids chasing each other, neighbors hauling lawn chairs into the grass. Someone set up a cornhole game. Someone else brought a cooler of homemade lemonade. And when I swung open the massive barn doors to reveal the shining interior, spotless, organized, stronger than ever, the crowd actually cheered. "Looks better than new Dante." Jenkins barked, raising his beer. "Fireproof," I hope another neighbor joked. I smirked. "Let's just say if anyone tries to burn this one down, they'll have a hell of a time." That got a roar of laughter. The food disappeared fast. Plates piled high with ribs, brisket, cornbread, potato salad. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with me now clapped me on the back, telling stories, thanking me for standing up when they hadn't. Even Mrs. Adler, still red with guilt, brought a tray of cookies and insisted on helping wash dishes. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the barn's new paint, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. See, revenge isn't always about destroying your enemy. Sometimes it's about thriving in spite of them. Lena wanted me broken, humiliated, begging for acceptance. Instead, I stood taller than ever, my barn rebuilt, my neighbors gathered around me, free of her grip. At one point, a kid tugged at my sleeve. "Mr. Carver," he asked, shyly, "is it true you're like a real fire guy?" Like a fire detective, I knelt down, smiling. "That's right, kid, fire tells stories. And it's my job to make sure the bad ones don't get away." He grinned, running off to tell his friends. And I thought maybe that's the real legacy here. Not just a barn, not just revenge, but a story this neighborhood would remember long after Lena's name was forgotten. Because make no mistake, she was forgotten. The HOA barely functioned without her. Meetings grew shorter, fines disappeared, rules loosened. Neighbors realized life didn't end if a lawn grew an inch too tall or if Christmas lights stayed up until February. The tyranny had been smoke and mirrors, and once the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to fear. Later that night, as the party wound down and the last embers of the smoker glowed red, I leaned against the barn door and looked out at the crowd. Families laughing, kids yawning, music playing softly from someone's speaker. My land, my barn, my community whole again. And I couldn't help but laugh. Not the bitter laugh of a man burned, but the full-bellied laugh of a man who'd won. Because in the end, Lena hadn't destroyed me. She'd rebuilt me. Stronger, smarter, untouchable. And the sweetest revenge of all, knowing she'd rot in a cell while I raised a glass in the barn she'd tried to erase. If Lena Hartman thought her story would end with handcuffs and mugshots, she was wrong. For people like her, the fall doesn't happen all at once. It happens in pieces, each one more humiliating than the last. The first piece fell in court. Her lawyer tried everything, claimed the evidence was circumstantial, claimed I had a vendetta, even tried to spin the fire as an accident caused by faulty wiring. But the problem with lying in court is that facts don't care about your theatrics. My reports, my samples, my photos, they didn't blink, they didn't waver. The prosecutor laid it out, plain accelerant fingerprints, surveillance footage, eyewitnesses. It took the jury less than 3 hours to convict her. Arson, reckless endangerment, criminal mischief. The queen of the HOA was sentenced not to months, but to years. And when the verdict was read, she collapsed into her chair, her pearls rattling against the wood like the last gasp of her reign. The second piece fell at home, or rather the home she once ruled. With Lena behind bars, the HOA scrambled for footing. They elected a new president, someone mild-mannered who'd spent more time planting roses than barking orders. The rules relaxed, the fines slowed. And the neighbors who once quaked in fear of Lena's clipboard now rolled their eyes whenever her name came up. She really thought she could control everyone, Mrs. Adler whispered to me one afternoon. But in the end, she couldn't even control herself. The third piece, that one was personal. Even behind bars, Lena tried to fight. She filed appeals, wrote letters to anyone who would listen, claiming I had framed her, that I had manipulated evidence. She even accused the entire neighborhood of conspiring against her. But every appeal was denied, every letter ignored. Eventually her voice faded into the background noise of the justice system, drowned out by louder, uglier cases. Lena Hartman was forgotten. And me, I kept moving forward. The barn stood proud and strong, the new heart of my property. I worked there every morning, the smell of fresh-cut lumber and motor oil replacing the stench of smoke. Kids from the neighborhood stopped by to watch me tinker with tools, their eyes wide with curiosity. I taught a few of them the basics, how to hammer a nail straight, how to read a level, and I realized I was passing down the same lessons my grandfather once gave me. One evening, as the sun set behind the barn's gleaming roof, I leaned against the doorframe and thought about everything that had happened. Lena's obsession, the fire, the investigation, the trial. And it struck me how ironic it all was. She had wanted to break me, she had wanted to erase my independence, to force me into her grip, but instead she had freed me. Freed me from her shadow, freed the neighborhood from her tyranny, and reminded me of a truth I'd nearly forgotten: bullies only have power if you let them. I chuckled to myself. Sometimes the best way to fight fire, I whispered, is with the law. And that's the lesson I carry to this day. Not every battle is won with fists or shouting. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's letting the truth stack up until it's so heavy your enemy collapses under its weight. And sometimes it's remembering that revenge isn't about destruction. It's about thriving where they wanted you to fail. So when I host barbecues now or hear the sound of laughter spilling from the barn, I think of Lena Hartman. Not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because without her fire, I might never have rebuilt stronger. Without her tyranny, the neighborhood might never have learned freedom. And every time I hear a siren in the distance, every time I see flames on the horizon, I remember that night. Not as the night I lost my barn, but as the night I discovered just how much one man's resolve can withstand. Lena tried to make me bend. Instead, she broke herself. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the only ending this story could ever have. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about barns or HOAs or one woman's obsession with control. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to bully you into submission. It's about patience, resilience, and knowing that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will burn brighter than any lie. I learned that real strength isn't in how loud you shout or how hard you fight back in the moment. Real strength is in refusing to be broken even when the flames rise around you. It's in letting the fire test you, shape you, and leave you stronger than before. If you've ever had someone like Lena Hartman in your life, someone who tried to control you, belittle you, or push you past your limits, remember this: their power only lasts as long as you allow it. Stand firm, collect your truth, And when the time comes, let justice speak louder than revenge ever could. Because in the end, it's not about what they take from you, it's about what you rebuild in their shadow. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done if someone burned down your barn? Drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe for more wild HOA stories. Trust me, there are plenty more fires to put out.